The sound of wet mud hitting the polished mahogany of my mother's casket is a sound that will haunt my nightmares until the day I join her in the earth. Thud, thud, thud. It was a heavy, rhythmic sound that signaled the absolute end of the only world I had ever known. I stood there, clutching a single damp handkerchief, feeling the freezing June rain soak through my black wool coat until it weighed 1,000 pounds. Around me, a small circle of mourners stood beneath a canopy of black umbrellas, looking like a cluster of somber vultures silhouetted against the leaden-gray sky. My mother, Rose, was gone. The woman who had been my anchor, my best friend, and my protector, was now being lowered into a dark, rectangular hole in the ground. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, so profound it felt as though my own heart had been surgically removed without anesthesia. I looked to my right, searching for the hand of my husband, Mark. I needed him to hold me. I needed him to tell me that we would get through this together. But Mark was not looking at the grave. He was staring at his gold wristwatch, his thumb tapping impatiently against his thigh. He looked less like a grieving son-in-law and more like a man waiting for a delayed flight. I reached out to touch his sleeve, but he pulled away to adjust his tie, his eyes darting toward his phone as it vibrated in his pocket. He did not say a word. He did not even look at me. The engine of our luxury sedan hummed with a clinical coldness as we left the cemetery gates behind. I rested my forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the blurred shapes of headstones disappear into the gray mist. I expected Mark to reach across the console and take my hand, to offer even a shred of the comfort he had promised me when we stood at the altar. Instead, he kept both of his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his knuckles white and rigid. Every few minutes, his phone, nestled in the cup holder, would light up with a new notification. He would glance down, his jaw tightening, before quickly swiping the screen to silence it. There was a frantic energy about him, a nervous vibration that felt entirely out of place on the day of my mother's funeral. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin and brittle like dry autumn leaves. "Can we talk about what the lawyer said regarding the final arrangements?" He did not look at me. He just pressed his foot harder on the accelerator, the car surging forward. "Not now, Clara. I have a lot on my mind. Business does not stop just because your mother did." The cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. This was not the man I had married. This was a stranger wearing his skin, a man whose eyes were fixed on a destination I could not see. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to block out the suffocating silence of the car and the icy indifference of my husband. I let my mind drift back to the Victorian house on Maple Street. That house was more than just a structure of wood and mortar, it was the very soul of my mother. I could almost smell the scent of cinnamon and tart apples that always filled the kitchen on Sunday afternoons. I could see her clearly in my mind, wearing her faded denim overalls, kneeling in the rich dirt of her garden while she tended to the heirloom roses she loved so much. She used to tell me that as long as we kept that roof over our heads, we would never truly be lost. It was our fortress, our one true sanctuary against a world that was often cruel. Every scratch on the mahogany floors and every faded patch of wallpaper told the story of our family. Now that she was gone, that house was the only physical piece of her I had left to hold on to. I just wanted to be home. I just wanted to walk through the front door, lock the world out, and breathe in her lingering scent one last time. As the car pulled up to the curb of Maple Street, my heart gave a small, hopeful leap at the sight of the familiar towering oak trees. I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape the cold tension of the vehicle and bury my face in my mother's pillows. But as my eyes focused on the front lawn, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. There, standing exactly where my mother used to plant her spring tulips, was a massive wooden sign. The letters were bold and black, screaming against a bright red background. One word was stamped diagonally across the top in a way that felt like a serrated blade across my throat. Sold. I froze, my hand still gripping the cold metal of the door handle. I could not breathe. I could not move. The oxygen in the car suddenly felt thick and toxic. This had to be a mistake. Perhaps a neighbor was playing a cruel prank. Perhaps the real estate company had the wrong address. I blinked rapidly, hoping the image would dissolve like a fever dream, but the sign remained. It was firm, rooted in the earth, and utterly final. The sanctuary I had spent my entire life in, the home my mother had worked so hard to keep, was no longer mine. I threw the car door open and stumbled onto the sidewalk, my legs feeling as though they were made of heavy lead. I forced myself to move, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as I ran up the wooden porch steps. The familiar groan of the floorboards beneath my feet usually felt like a warm greeting, but today, it sounded like a warning. I reached into my black leather handbag and pulled out my keychain, my fingers trembling so violently that the metal clattered like chattering teeth. I took the brass key, the one my mother had given to me when I was only 6 years old, and tried to slide it into the deadbolt. It would not go in. I tried again, pushing with every ounce of my strength, but the lock remained stubborn and cold. I flipped the key over, thinking my grief had made me clumsy, but it still refused to turn. I looked closer at the lock cylinder. It was brand new. It was shiny and devoid of the familiar scratches and wear that had accumulated over 30 years of use. Mark had changed the locks. He had not just put a sign in the yard. He had physically barred me from the only home I had ever known. I began to pound on the heavy oak door with my fists, the vibration rattling my bones. I screamed his name, my voice cracking and raw, but the house remained silent and indifferent to my pain. The heavy oak door finally creaked open, but it was not Mark who stood on the threshold. Instead, I found myself staring at a man and a woman I had never seen before in my life. They were dressed in soft, casual sweaters, and the woman held a steaming ceramic mug that sent a familiar aroma of hazelnut coffee into the damp air. It was the same brand my mother had bought for 20 years, but seeing it in the hands of a stranger felt like a jagged piece of glass piercing my soul. They looked at me with a mixture of confusion and growing discomfort. "Can I help you with something?" the man asked, his voice cautious and distant. I could only stare at him, my lips trembling. I live here. This is my mother's house. Why are you in my kitchen?" The woman stepped forward, her eyes flickering with a momentary flash of pity. "Oh, you must be the daughter. We were told there might be some loose ends. We are very sorry for your loss, but we purchased this property through a private cash sale this morning. The closing was finalized exactly 2 hours ago." The seller assured us the house was vacant and that all legalities had been settled. 2 hours ago? I whispered, my knees buckling. While I was standing over my mother's casket in the pouring rain, someone had been signing away the very ground beneath my feet. The sound of heavy footsteps on the polished hardwood floor echoed from the hallway. And then Mark appeared. He was wearing the expensive charcoal gray suit I had purchased for him for our 3rd anniversary, looking every bit like the successful businessman I had helped him become. But he was not alone. Walking close behind him, her hand resting possessively on the sleeve of his jacket, was Sarah. I recognized her instantly. She was the woman he had introduced to me 6 months ago as his new executive assistant. She was wearing a silk dress in a shade of emerald green that was far too bright for a day of mourning, and her lips were painted a sharp, defiant red. "Mark, what is happening?" I screamed, my voice echoing through the foyer. "Who are these people? Why are they saying the house is sold?" Mark did not flinch. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He stepped toward me, his expression cold and calculating. "It is quite simple, Clara. The house is sold because I sold it. You were always too sentimental about this place. It was a wasted asset, a crumbling pile of bricks that was draining our potential." He turned to Sarah and pulled her closer to his side. "This is Sarah, but I think you already knew that. We are moving on, Clara. We are starting a new life, and frankly, there is no room for you or the memory of your mother in it. I needed the capital to fund our new venture, and this house was the quickest way to get it." The air felt as if it had turned to ice. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to tell me this was some twisted joke, a terrible test of my strength, but the cruel curve of his mouth told me everything I needed to know. He reached behind him into the hallway and grabbed my black leather weekend bag, the one I had packed in a hurry before the funeral began. Without a single word of warning, he stepped onto the porch and swung his arm. The bag sailed through the rainy air and landed with a sickening, wet thud in the thick mud at the bottom of the steps. The zipper burst on impact, spilling my mother's favorite pearls and my only change of clothes into the dirty brown slush. "Pick it up and get off this property, Clara," Mark barked, his voice devoid of any human emotion. "You do not belong here anymore. The buyers want to begin their renovations, and your presence is making them uncomfortable." I stared at the mud-stained pearls, the very ones my father had given to my mother on their 25th wedding anniversary. They looked like discarded teeth in the dirt. I felt a hot, searing wave of humiliation wash over me, turning my skin red and my blood to fire. 500 people in this town had looked up to us as the perfect couple, and now I was being treated like a common trespasser on the land that bore my family name. Mark took a step toward me, his shadow looming over me like a predator. I said, "Move," he hissed. "Or should I call the police to have you removed?" "How?" I choked out, the word feeling like a jagged stone in my throat. "The deed is in my name. The estate of my mother has not even been through probate. You cannot sell what is not yours, Mark." Mark let out a sharp, dry laugh that sent chills down my spine. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a crisp, white document. "You really should pay more attention to the things you sign, Clara. Do you remember that night at the hospital? The night your mother's heart finally gave out?" I remembered it too well. The flashing red lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the crushing weight of the doctor's words. I remembered Mark handing me a stack of papers, telling me they were medical release forms and funeral authorizations. I had been blinded by tears, my hand trembling as I scrawled my name on every line he pointed to. I had trusted him with my life because I thought he was my rock. "You signed a durable power of attorney, Clara," Mark said, his voice dripping with a sickening sense of triumph. "You gave me full authority over your legal and financial affairs. I did not even have to forge your signature. You gave it to me freely. This sale is perfectly legal. I have the right to act on your behalf, and I decided that we needed the liquidity more than you needed a house full of old memories and dust. You were always so weak when it came to your mother. I just did what was necessary for our future." The realization washed over me, colder than the rain. He had planned this. He had sat by my mother's deathbed and calculated the market value of her home. He had waited for the moment of my greatest agony to steal my birthright. As I stood there, trembling in the cold, a large, white moving truck pulled into the driveway behind the sedan of Mark. Two men in orange vests jumped out and began walking toward the front porch. I watched in horror as Mark stepped aside and pointed a finger toward the open front door. "Everything in the attic and the master bedroom goes to the landfill," Mark instructed, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "Do not bother sorting through it. It is all just clutter and old paper." I tried to push past him, but he blocked my path with his arm. I watched as one of the men emerged from the house carrying a handmade quilt. It was the quilt my mother had stitched for me by hand when I was only 5 years old. It was made from scraps of my old baby clothes, a tapestry of my entire childhood. The man tossed it carelessly into the dark maw of the garbage truck as if it were a dirty rag. "No! Stop!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Those are her journals. Those are our family photos. You have no right to destroy them." Mark looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "I have every right, Clara. They are dragging you down, and they are taking up space in a house that no longer belongs to you. You should thank me for clearing out the trash of your past." I watched as 30 years of memories were reduced to a pile of refuse. My heart did not just break, it shattered into a million jagged pieces. Mark leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and cold ambition. He looked down at my rain-soaked clothes and my mud-stained shoes with a sneer that made me feel smaller than the dirt beneath his feet. "You think you are going to fight me, Clara?" he whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "With what? I have seen your personal checking account. You have exactly $42.16 to your name. I moved the rest of our joint savings into a private offshore fund weeks ago. You cannot even afford a decent meal, let alone a lawyer who could stand against the legal team I have on retainer." He stepped back and gestured toward his sleek black sedan, where Sarah was waiting impatiently. "We are going to a celebratory dinner at a penthouse in Manhattan. You, on the other hand, look like you belong in a homeless shelter. Nobody is coming to save you, Clara. Your mother is in the ground and your bank account is at zero. You are a ghost in a world that only cares about winners. Do yourself a favor and disappear before I decide to have you arrested for trespassing on a property that is no longer yours." The cruelty in his eyes was absolute. He was not just leaving me. He was making sure I knew that I was nothing without him. My friends. My heart is pounding just retelling this moment of betrayal. I stood in the rain, humiliated and alone. I have a question for you. And please be honest. Comment the number 1 if you think I should have fought back right there and made a scene. Comment the number 2 if you believe I should have walked away and planned a cold, calculated revenge. I made my choice, and it changed everything. The door to the roadside motel room clicked shut with a metallic finality that echoed against the peeling beige wallpaper. I stood in the middle of the cramped space, the air smelling of stale cigarettes and industrial-grade lemon cleaner. A flickering neon sign from the diner across the street cast a rhythmic, sickly pink glow over the thin, polyester bedspread. I had exactly $42 in my pocket and a single bag of mud-stained clothes. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, the springs groaning under my weight like a tired animal. For hours, I simply stared at the cracked ceiling, the silence of the room pressing against my eardrums. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. But as the minutes ticked by, the hot, stinging tears of grief began to dry, leaving behind something much harder and colder. The image of the smug face of Mark and the way Sarah had touched the furniture of my mother burned in my mind like a brand. I realized then that I could not afford to be a victim. If I allowed myself to shatter, they would win. My sorrow was beginning to crystallize into a sharp, jagged edge of pure determination. I was not just going to survive. I was going to take back every single thing that belonged to my mother and me. I reached for the one bag I had managed to pull from the mud. My hands were still shaking as I wiped the brown sludge off the leather with a scratchy, thin motel towel. As I reached into the side pocket, my fingers brushed against a secret compartment I had almost forgotten existed. Inside, tucked away beneath the silk lining of an old jewelry case, was a small box made of dark walnut wood. It was no larger than the palm of my hand, but it felt as heavy as a mountain in my trembling grasp. I remembered the afternoon my mother had given it to me. We were sitting on the porch of the house on Maple Street, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of violet and gold. She had taken my hands in hers and looked at me with an intensity that had confused me back then. "Clara," she had whispered, "life is unpredictable. If there ever comes a day when you feel like the world has turned its back on you, and you have no one left to trust, I want you to open this." I had tucked it away years ago, never imagining that the day she spoke of would actually arrive. My breath hitched in my throat as I traced the intricate carvings on the lid. With a trembling hand, I unhooked the tiny brass latch and allowed the lid to creak open. I stared at the contents of the box. A thick, yellowed envelope was tucked inside. I pulled it out and saw the words "Family Trust Agreement" printed in bold, legal font. My mother had always been a woman of secrets, but I had never realized how deep those secrets went. Beneath the document was a letter, handwritten in her elegant, looping script. My eyes blurred with fresh tears as I recognized her scent lavender and old paper clinging to the parchment. I read the words she had left for me. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to protect you. I have seen the way Mark looks at our home, not with love, but with calculation. I saw a hunger in his eyes that you were too blinded by love to notice. That is why I placed the house on Maple Street into an irrevocable family trust. It is not just a piece of property. It is your birthright. No matter what papers you might have signed in your grief, this trust is the ultimate authority. You are the sole beneficiary, and the house cannot be sold or transferred without the explicit signature of a designated co-trustee." The name of the co-trustee was printed at the bottom of the final page. My heart skipped a beat as I read the name. It was someone who had been like a father to me. Someone who knew the law better than anyone in the state. He was a man who would not be intimidated by the cheap tricks of Mark. I realized then that my mother had left me a sword to fight with, even from beyond the grave. The office of Elias Thorne was located on the top floor of a glass skyscraper that overlooked the harbor. It was a place of dark mahogany and sharp edges, smelling of expensive tobacco and ancient law books. I walked through the heavy glass doors, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt out of place in my wrinkled clothes. But the receptionist did not even ask for my name. She simply gestured toward the massive corner office. Elias was standing by the window, his back to the door. He was a tall man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than a year of my rent. He turned around as I entered, and for the first time since my mother died, I saw a flicker of genuine compassion in the eyes of another human being. "Clara," he said, his voice deep and gravelly like a shifting mountain. "I have been waiting for your call. I saw the obituary for Rose, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Mark made his move. That man has the soul of a vulture, and I have spent 30 years hunting vultures. He gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair. He did not ask how I was doing. He knew the answer. Instead, he reached out and took the walnut box from my hand. Do not worry, child. Your mother was 3 steps ahead of him. Now, let us see exactly how much trouble we can cause for your husband. Elias spread the yellowed pages across his massive desk, his eyes scanning the lines with a terrifying speed. He let out a low, cold chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. It was the sound of a predator that had finally found the scent of its prey. Mark is an amateur playing a game of professionals, Elias stated, tapping his silver pen against the parchment. He believes that because he tricked you into signing a power of attorney while you were blinded by grief, he has the keys to the kingdom. But he failed to realize one crucial thing. This trust is irrevocable. It is a fortress that your mother built specifically to keep men like him out. He turned the page, pointing to a signature line that remained empty. The trust mandates that any sale or transfer of the property on Maple Street requires the explicit, notarized signature of the designated co-trustee. That co-trustee is me, Clara. I did not sign any deed. I did not authorize any sale. Therefore, the transaction he finalized this morning is not just unethical. It is legally non-existent. He leaned forward, the light reflecting off his glasses. Furthermore, the 2 witnesses he used for your power of attorney signature are his own subordinates. I have already confirmed through their digital logs that they were at their desks in the office at the exact moment you were at the hospital. He has committed 3 counts of felony fraud. He did not just steal your house, he has handed us the rope to hang him with. Elias leaned back in his leather chair, his silver hair catching the light. Clara, for the next 2 weeks, you must become a ghost, he said. Do not call Mark. Do not visit the house. Do not even post a single word on social media. I want him to believe he has successfully crushed your spirit. I want him to think you are huddled in a dark room somewhere, defeated and destitute. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with the focus of a predator. When a man like Mark thinks he has won, he becomes sloppy. He will begin to spend the money he thinks he has earned. He will make bold, reckless investments and sign contracts without reading the fine print. He will show his hand before the real game begins. While he is celebrating his hollow victory, we will be preparing the strike that will end him. Let him enjoy the sunlight for a few more days. The darkness we are bringing is absolute. Mark did not waste a single second. While I was hiding in that dim motel room, eating cold soup and counting my remaining dollars, he was living the life he thought he deserved. Elias informed me that Mark had already moved the $300,000 from the illegal sale into a high-risk venture capital project. He wanted to triple his money overnight. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he did not see the trap he was walking into. He and Sarah had moved into a penthouse apartment that cost $15,000 a month, and they were already sending out gold-embossed invitations for a housewarming gala. He wanted every influential person in the city to see his new crown. He wanted to be the king of a mountain built on the grave of my mother. He believed that he had successfully buried me along with her. Little did he know, his kingdom was made of glass, and I was finally holding the hammer. Elias did not just provide a legal strategy, he provided a war chest. He gave me access to an account that my mother had established years ago for a rainy day. I traded my stained, cheap catering uniform for a gown made of midnight blue silk that felt like liquid power against my skin. I spent 5 hours at a high-end salon where they transformed my exhausted, tangled hair into a crown of sleek, obsidian waves. I looked into the mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back at me. The hollow-eyed, grieving girl was gone. In her place stood the true owner of the Maple Street house. My mother was an architect of buildings, and I was now the architect of my own justice. I practiced my walk, my voice, and my cold, steady gaze. I was no longer the help. I was the storm. The penthouse was a monument to excess, perched high above the city lights of Manhattan like a throne made of glass and steel. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the heavy, metallic tang of vintage champagne. I stood outside the heavy mahogany doors for a moment, listening to the muffled roar of laughter and the soft, rhythmic pulse of a jazz quartet. It was a gathering of the elite judges, developers, and socialites who traded in favors and secrets. Inside, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline, a view that Mark had bought with the history of my family. He was standing at the center of the room, holding a crystal glass of whiskey, his head thrown back as he laughed at a joke made by a city councilman. He looked as though he had never known a day of struggle. Sarah was draped in a gown of shimmering gold, her hand resting on the shoulder of Mark as if she were the queen of a new empire. They moved through the crowd with an insufferable arrogance, accepting congratulations for a project they had not built and a future they had stolen from a grieving woman. They were basking in the glow of their own deception, entirely unaware that the foundation of their new life was about to crumble. I did not ask for permission to enter. I simply signaled to the server at the door, and the massive mahogany panels swung inward with a heavy, deliberate groan. I stepped into the light of the crystal chandeliers, the heels of my midnight blue shoes striking the marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the music like a gunshot. The room did not just quiet down. It went absolutely frozen. The laughter of the city councilman died mid-breath. The jazz quartet faltered. The saxophone let out a lonely, lingering note. And then there was nothing but the sound of 500 people holding their breath. I could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on me, scanning my sleek obsidian hair and the silk that shimmered like a deep, dark ocean under the gallery lights. I kept my gaze fixed on the center of the room. Mark was standing there, his whiskey glass halfway to his lips, his mouth hanging open in a silent, comical gasp. The color drained from his face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled at his feet, leaving his skin the shade of wet parchment. Beside him, Sarah gripped the stem of her champagne flute so hard that I thought the glass might shatter. Her eyes darted from my face to my gown, her expression shifting from confusion to a primal, shivering terror. I was not the broken girl they had left in the mud. I was a ghost that had come back to life, and I was more beautiful and dangerous than they could ever have imagined. I walked toward them, one steady step at a time, until I was standing exactly 3 feet away from the man who thought he had destroyed me. Mark recovered his composure first, though his hand was still trembling so much that the ice in his glass rattled against the crystal. He forced a jagged, ugly laugh and looked around the room, desperately trying to catch the eyes of his wealthy associates. He wanted to show them that he was still the one in control, that I was nothing more than an uninvited nuisance. "Clara, really," he sneered, his voice loud enough to carry to the back of the room. "I see you have spent the last of your pennies on a rental dress to play dress-up. Did you think a bit of silk would make us forget that you are a penniless orphan with nowhere to go?" He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal blazer and pulled out a slim, leather-bound checkbook. With a flourish of his gold-plated pen, he scribbled something and tore the paper from the book. "I am a generous man," he said, holding the paper between 2 fingers. "Here is $1,000. It is more than you have ever seen in your life. Take it, go back to your cheap motel, and stay out of my sight. This is a party for people who actually matter." He did not hand it to me. He let it go, watching with a look of pure, concentrated malice as the paper fluttered through the air. It landed on the polished marble floor, resting near the toe of my shoe. The room remained silent as the guests watched the humiliation unfold. Sarah let out a soft, mocking giggle, her eyes gleaming with triumph. They expected me to kneel. They expected me to crawl for the scraps of their stolen fortune. The entire room is frozen as the $1,000 check lies abandoned on the marble floor. I have a critical choice to make right now. Should I pick up the paper and walk away forever, or should I stand my ground and reveal the devastating truth? Please comment the number 1 if you believe I should take the money and start a new life. Comment the number 2 if you think I should stay and fight for justice. Mark began to laugh, a jagged and mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the penthouse. He turned to his guests, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, some people simply do not know when they are not welcome," he sneered. "My former wife always had a flair for the dramatic, but drama does not pay the bills." Just as the first few murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the crowd, the massive mahogany doors at the far end of the hall were thrown open with a force so great that it made the crystal chandeliers rattle. The laughter of Mark died in his throat. Stepping through the doorway was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of granite and silver. Elias Thorne did not just enter a room. He commanded it entirely. His presence was like a cold front moving through a summer day, causing every conversation to freeze instantly. He wore a suit that radiated absolute power, and he carried a leather briefcase like a weapon of war. He did not look at the guests or the lavish decorations. His eyes were fixed solely on the man standing in the center of the room. I could see beads of sweat beginning to form on the forehead of Mark as he recognized the face of the most feared lawyer in the state. Elias stepped to my side, placing a steady and encouraging hand on my shoulder. I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding regarding the ownership of this property, Elias declared, his voice booming like distant thunder. Elias opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents that were marked with official legal seals from the state Supreme Court. The room was so incredibly silent that the soft rustle of the paper sounded like a crack of thunder against the marble walls. Mark Harrison, Elias began, his voice cold and mathematically precise. You claimed that Clara signed a power of attorney giving you the absolute permission to sell her family home on the 14th of October at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. However, I have here the authenticated digital logs from the security system of the St. Jude Medical Center. He turned a page and held it up for the stunned guests to see, his eyes never leaving the terrified face of Mark. At the exact time you claim this document was signed in your private office, Clara was at the bedside of her mother in the intensive care unit, 3 miles away. I have 34 witnesses, including the attending surgeons and nursing staff, who can testify that she never once left that hospital room. Furthermore, a forensic handwriting expert has analyzed the ink and the stroke patterns on this signature. He has determined that it is a crude and desperate imitation of the handwriting of my client. Mark tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but his voice was nothing more than a choked and pathetic wheeze. Elias did not stop for even a second. You used 2 of your own junior employees to notarize this forgery. I have already spoken to those individuals under oath this morning. They have signed sworn affidavits admitting that you threatened to fire them if they did not participate in this criminal fraud. This is not just a simple civil dispute. It is a calculated criminal conspiracy. The deed you used to sell this house is a fraudulent instrument, and every single dollar you have received from this illegal transaction is now subject to immediate and total seizure by the court. The silence that had gripped the room shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of noise and confusion. I watched as the influential guests, the very people who had been toasting the success of Mark only moments ago, began to back away from him, as if he were carrying a deadly contagion. The city councilman, who had been laughing so loudly earlier, set his glass down on a passing tray and turned his back completely, his face a mask of cold indifference. The murmur of the crowd grew into a deafening roar of whispers. They were not just shocked by the crime, they were terrified of being associated with a common thief. In the corner of the room, I saw the couple who had purchased my family home. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling stood frozen, their faces pale, and their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and realization. They had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a dream that was built on a foundation of lies. Mrs. Sterling clutched her pearl necklace so tightly that I thought the string might snap. She looked at Mark with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. She realized that her beautiful new life was nothing more than a crime scene. The air in the penthouse became thick with the scent of a dying empire. Mark looked around the room, his eyes darting from one face to another, searching for a single ally, but he found only a wall of cold, hard stares. The power he had spent months building through deception had evaporated in less than 10 minutes. He was no longer the king of the city, he was a social pariah, and the weight of his own actions was finally beginning to crush him. Sarah had been standing by the window, her hand trembling as she watched the guests turn away. She was not a woman who would ever go down with a sinking ship. She looked at Mark, and for the first time, there was no adoration in her eyes, only a sharp, calculating coldness. She stepped forward, her silk gown rustling against the heavy silence of the room. "I cannot believe this," she cried out, her voice high and artificial, a perfect performance of a woman betrayed. "Mark, you told me that the property was legally yours. You told me that Clara had willingly walked away because she could not handle the responsibility of the estate." She turned to face Elias and the crowd, her eyes welling with forced crocodile tears. "I am a victim of his lies just as much as anyone else in this room. I had no idea that he had forged those documents. In fact, I have been worried about his business practices for many weeks." She reached into her small, beaded clutch bag and pulled out a gold-plated flash drive. I did not want to believe it, but I kept copies of the emails he sent to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He has been hiding money from his partners for over 3 years. I was going to take this to the authorities myself, but I was too afraid of what he might do to me. Mark stared at her, his jaw dropping in a silent scream of total disbelief. The woman for whom he had destroyed his marriage, his family, and his reputation was now the one hammering the final nail into his coffin. He tried to reach for her, but Sarah recoiled as if his touch were poison. She had already decided that he was no longer useful to her, and in the world they inhabited, there was no room for loyalty to a man who had lost everything. The police officers, who had been standing by the entrance like silent sentinels, finally stepped forward. Their heavy boots made a dull, rhythmic thud against the polished marble floor, a sound that signaled the absolute end of the world for Mark. He did not even try to run. He stood there, frozen, looking at Sarah as if he were seeing a ghost, his hands hanging limp at his sides. One of the officers, a man with a face as weathered as an old oak tree, reached for the handcuffs on his belt. The metallic click of the steel rings echoed through the silent room like a gavel in a courtroom, a final and absolute punctuation mark on his life of crime. Mark Harrison, you are under arrest for felony fraud, forgery, and the misappropriation of trust assets, the officer stated in a voice that was devoid of any emotion. You have the right to remain silent, but I doubt that any words will save you now. The guests watched in total, breathless silence, their faces lit by the flashes of the photographers who had somehow gathered in the lobby downstairs. Mark looked at me one last time as the cold metal tightened around his wrists. His eyes were filled with a mixture of venomous hatred and a pathetic, begging desperation that made my skin crawl. I did not look away. I stood tall, my shoulders back, wanting him to see that the girl he had left in the mud was the woman who had finally brought him to justice. As they led him toward the elevator, the heavy, stumbling sound of his footsteps faded into the distance. The empire of Mark had not just fallen. It had been dismantled, piece by piece, by the very truth he had tried so hard to bury. The penthouse, once a symbol of his stolen success, now felt like nothing more than a hollow, glass cage. Elias turned his attention toward the Sterling couple, who were standing near the fireplace, looking as though their entire world had collapsed into a heap of ash. "Mr." Sterling began to speak, his voice trembling with a mixture of hot anger and cold panic. "What about our money?" he demanded, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "We paid over $800,000 for this house. We have a signed deed and a legal contract." Elias did not even flinch. He did not move a single muscle as he faced them. "You have a piece of paper that was signed by a criminal using a forged signature," he replied, his voice echoing with a cold professional finality that left no room for argument. "Under the law of this state, a fraudulent deed conveys no title. Your contract is not just voidable, it is void from the very beginning. You will have to seek restitution from the frozen assets of Mark Harrison, but as of this moment, you have no legal right to remain on the property on Maple Street." The Sterlings looked at each other in a state of total, soul-crushing defeat. They had been used as pawns in a game they did not even know was being played. Elias then reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. He opened it to reveal the heavy brass key to the front door of my family home, the very same key that Mark had snatched from my hand weeks ago. "Clara," Elias said, his expression softening for the first time that evening. "The court has issued an emergency injunction. Your ownership is restored. The house is yours again." As I reached out and took the key, the cold metal felt like a bolt of lightning through my fingers. The weight of it was substantial, a physical anchor that connected me back to the generations of my family who had walked those halls. I was no longer a guest in a world of strangers or a victim of a cruel game. I was the mistress of my own destiny. I looked at the crowd of people who had watched me suffer in silence, and I realized that I did not need their approval or their pity. I had the truth, and I had my home. The battle for the house on Maple Street was over, and the era of my reclamation had finally begun. I sat across from him in the interrogation room, the smell of stale coffee and cold concrete filling the small, cramped space. Mark looked smaller than I remembered. Without his expensive suits and the aura of stolen power, he was just a middle-aged man with thinning hair and hands that would not stop shaking. The buzzing of the fluorescent light above us was the only sound for a long, heavy minute. "You think you have won, do you not?" he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "You and that dinosaur Elias. But Sarah, she took everything. She left me with nothing. She was the one who pushed me to sell that house, Clara. It was all her idea." I looked at him, and for the first time in many years, I did not feel anger. I did not feel the urge to scream. or demand an apology. I felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity. I did not come here to gloat, Mark. I came here to see the truth. You spent your whole life trying to make me feel small so that you could feel big. But now, in this gray room, we both see exactly what you are without your lies. He lunged forward as far as his handcuffs would allow, the metal chain clinking sharply against the table, his eyes wide and bloodshot. I loved you, Clara. Everything I did was for us. No, I said, standing up and smoothing my coat with a steady hand. Everything you did was for you. You did not love me. You loved the idea of owning me. But you cannot own a person who finally knows their own value. I turned toward the heavy metal door, signaled the guard, and did not look back. As the lock clicked shut behind me, I left the ghost of Mark Harrison in the shadows where he belonged. I was walking back into the sunlight, and for the first time, I was walking alone by choice. The drive back to Maple Street was quiet, and the air was filled with the fresh scent of earth after the storm. As I stepped onto the front porch, the old wooden boards did not creak under my feet this time. They seemed to welcome me with a familiar and steady hum. I pushed the heavy oak door open and walked into the foyer. The house was empty of the expensive furniture Mark had bought with stolen money, and the walls were bare where the Sterlings had hung their modern art. To many, it would have looked like a hollow shell, but to me, it was a sanctuary that had finally been cleansed. I walked into the living room, my footsteps echoing softly against the original hardwood floors that my father had laid 40 years ago. In my hands, I carried the one thing that mattered most, the silver-framed photograph of my mother that I had rescued from the mud. I stood before the fireplace, where the mantelpiece remained strong and unshakable. I took a deep breath and placed the photo exactly in the center, directly under the light that filtered through the high windows. I looked at the gentle smile of my mother, and I felt a wave of peace that I have not known since the day of the funeral. The legacy of the Rosewood family was no longer a collection of legal documents or a list of assets. It was back where it belonged, rooted in the very soil and stone of the home she had loved. The house was not just a building anymore. It was a living testimony to the fact that the truth cannot be buried forever. I sat by the large bay window and watched the shadows of the oak trees stretch across the lawn. This experience has taught me a lesson that I will carry for the rest of my life. We often choose to believe the best in the people we love, but sometimes that love acts as a blindfold that hides the darkest intentions. Mark did not just try to steal my house. He attempted to steal my very identity and my peace of mind. I now understand that vigilance is not the same as paranoia. It is a necessary form of self-respect and a way to honor those who came before us. You must guard your legacy with the same ferocity that others will use to try and take it from you. Do not ever let someone else hold the pen when it comes to the story of your future. Trust is a gift that must be earned every single day, and once it is shattered into 1,000 pieces, it can never be reconstructed in the same way. Being aware of the world around you is the only way to ensure that your foundation remains unshakable. I have realized that the greatest source of my power did not come from a bank account or a legal document. It came from the roots that my mother planted deep within my soul. Filial piety is not just about showing respect. It is about protecting the light that those who loved us left behind. When I was standing in the mud with nothing but my name, it was the memory of her unwavering belief in me that kept my spirit alive. By fighting for this house, I was fighting for her voice and her sacrifice. We are the living continuations of our ancestors, and when we stand up for the truth, we honor every drop of blood they gave to build a life for us. My mother taught me that a home is not built of wood and stone, but of the promises we keep to those we have lost. Thank you for walking this long and difficult road with me. If you believe that justice should always prevail and that the truth is worth fighting for, please give this video a like. My journey from the mud of the cemetery back to the halls of my family home was only possible because I refused to remain a victim. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Have you ever had to stand up for your own legacy? If you want to see more stories of resilience and the triumph of the truth, please subscribe to this channel and join our community. Always remember that you are the architect of your own truth, and no one can take that power from you unless you allow them to. Until we meet again, stay strong, trust your journey, and keep moving forward. This image is completely not real. It is just a product of Photoshop and AI, used to illustrate the content only. Don't believe in that, verify the information, and prove that this image is not real. The stories and images on this channel are inspired by real experiences and online communities like Reddit. For privacy and storytelling purposes, names, dates, and certain details have been changed or created using AI. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. This content is intended for entertainment and emotional reflection only. Viewer discretion is advised. Thank you for supporting our creative work.